If you ask any sports fan what their favorite season of competition was, they're most likely going to give one of two answers. One is when their team completely obliterated the competition and cruised to an easy championship trophy. The other is when the competition was close and the championship went right down to the wire with no clear winner in sight. This is where the rest of us fall because, let's face it, most of our teams are complete shitters. These nail-biters are the best championship seasons because they're fun to watch even for outsiders. There's real stakes at play, and just watching two or more elite teams sort it out in a winner-takes-all finale is perfect film material. Peyton Manning's Colts versus Tom Brady's Patriots in the AFC Championship year after year, or LeBron's Cavaliers against Curry's Warriors in the 2010s, or Clemson versus Alabama in college football. That is the stuff of legends. People will be talking about those events 100 years from now. And NASCAR has their fair share of championship fights that went right down to the very last lap of the race. Stewart versus Edwards in 2011 that resulted in a tiebreaker. Jeff Gordon versus Terry Labonte in 96 that saw the Iceman get the leg up over the young phenom, and Petty versus Waltrip in 1979 when Jaws faltered at the last possible moment. NASCAR has arguably been built off the backs of fierce championship battles, because for most of its run the championship was decided via a season-long points format. Every race and every pass mattered, and that was never more evident than at the 1992 championship finale at Atlanta.
Wait. Hold on there, Slap. As much as I'd love to just jump into the greatest race of all time, we've got to talk about the year that preceded it. A year that, in retrospect, should have been nothing special. Sandwiched smack dab in the middle of two pairs of Earnhardt championships, you would think that 1992 would simply be his fifth. But as it so happens, Earnhardt wouldn't just lose the championship this year, he wouldn't even come close. Instead, it would boil down to three other contenders: an established champion with a new team, a young hotshot carrying the weight of his family name, and a journeyman racing his own cars for his own team and trying to write his own story. The fight between these three men, these three unlikely competitors, would forge NASCAR's finest hour, and in the case of two of them, make for its darkest the following year, leaving an indelible hole in the motorsports world at large. This story is perseverance manifested, one of broken mold and broken bones, of the past conceding to the future, but more so than that, the most competitive NASCAR season we'll ever see. But before we dig into the closest title battle in NASCAR history, it's important that I mention the last closest title battle in NASCAR history, because the benefactor of that battle is gearing up for his retirement tour, as this year would see the final ride for Richard Petty. To spare you a 12-minute spiel on why he's rightfully called the king, you can just go watch this video. But if you don't want to do that, first of all, fuck you. And second, the man is a living legend, NASCAR's first superstar, and even back then, in 1992, people knew it. The numbers next to Petty's name were borderline unfathomable, so much so that even today, I can confidently say that they will never be surpassed, tied, or even threatened. His success and longevity rendered him not just an icon in motorsports, but sports in general, the prototypical American race car driver. But the past decade has done little to help that image. Heading into the 92 season, Petty had been winless for 7 straight years, 212 races since he had last lifted a trophy. And on top of that, within that time span were some of the lowest moments of his whole career, like injuring his leg in the 1988 Daytona 500 and failing to qualify for a 1989 race at Richmond. As much as he had done for the sport, it was beginning to pass him by, and as much as he wanted to race, even when it seemed like racing didn't want him, he knew his days would soon be numbered. So in October of 91, he made the call.
It will be my last year next year, and it will be known as a fan appreciation tour.
For the most illustrious career the sport had ever seen, it wouldn't feel right to just leave like so many of his competitors did. He wanted to give the people one more chance to see him as a NASCAR driver, so along with his final stretch of races, he would host the Fan Appreciation Tour, hosting autograph signings and special events alongside his regular race weekend routine. Nowadays, these kinds of retirement tours are a dime a dozen, but back then it was practically unheard of. So if your favorite driver is retiring but gives you one last chance to go and meet him, don't just thank him, thank Richard Petty. And besides, running one more year would also allow him to race in one more generation of car, as 92 would introduce a slicker and safer alternative to the car before, the Gen 4, a model that would end up getting utilized for the next 15 years. Now with one last throne to call his own, Petty was set for his last hurrah. But how could he or anyone else have known that intersecting with his swan song would be one of the most intense, intriguing, and iconic seasons the sport would ever see?
And we're ready to go green.
As with most years in NASCAR, our story begins with the Daytona 500, where 42 starters prepare to take to the high banks for the 34th time. Leading them to green and locking out the front row are Junior Johnson's boys, Sterling Marlin in the Maxwell House 22 and Bill Elliott in the Budweiser 11. That 11 car in particular would become a key player, but we'll get into him later because after a collision with Ernie Irvan about halfway through the race, he and his teammate would clear the way for NASCAR's favorite son, a second-generation star who was poised to take his first big stab at a NASCAR Cup championship.
And Davey Allison is going to win the Daytona 500.
The heir to NASCAR royalty, Davey Allison was looked at as the future, as he was the son of one of the greatest, Bobby Allison, an 84-win champion with a near 30-year career. That's a tough act to follow, and a couple years ago he had to literally follow it in the 88 Daytona 500. Well now, 4 years later, the tides have turned. Davey is no longer the student, but the master, and now paired with an equally young and equally fiery crew chief in Larry McReynolds, the Haviland 28 had found its place at the top, a place in which it would get very familiar. The following race seemed to reinforce that notion, as Allison would storm to the front and hold the lead for most of the first half. But in complete contrast to the 500, he would give way to a familiar face, not just in the context of this video, but the sport as a whole, as the person passing him was none other than NASCAR's most popular driver and the other key player in our story, Bill Elliott. After a 10-year tenure with Melling Racing that included 34 wins, a championship, and the fastest stock car ever built, the perennial winner of the Most Popular Driver Award was ready for a change of scenery. And it just so happened that, at the time, another team had found themselves in a similar slump, Junior Johnson's accomplished number 11. And when I say accomplished, I mean one of the most decorated cars in racing history. If there was ever an all-star car in NASCAR, it's this one. 3 championships with Cale Yarborough, 3 championships with Darrell Waltrip, and a flurry of wins from the likes of Bobby Allison, Terry Labonte, and Jeff Bodine. As a driver, if there was ever a seat you wanted to fill, it was this one. And just a few days into the new year, Bill Elliott got the offer to drive the best ride in racing. Unfortunately, that ride would end up getting mangled by the wreck in the 500, relegating him to a 27th place finish to start the year. That is not the kind of kickoff you expect from a dream team. So when does it start living up to the hype?
And here comes Bill Elliott, poised to win his first race for Junior Johnson in the Budweiser Ford.
They touch and across the line. It's Elliott. Bill Elliott has done it by about a foot to a foot and a half.
And here comes Bill Elliott. 3 in a row as Elliott wins on his hometown track here in Atlanta.
Checkered flag is waiting. There it is. Elliott wins his 4th consecutive Winston Cup race in 1992.
Yeah. In his first 5 starts with his new team, Bill Elliott won in 4 of them, leading just shy of half the laps in that stretch and putting the whole racing world on notice. It was easily one of the most explosive starts to a tenure for any driver ever, though you might be surprised to learn that even after those wins, those 4 consecutive wins, Davey Allison still maintained the points lead with a runner-up in race 2 and 3 consecutive 4th places. Just 5 races in and we already have our contenders, the 2 heavyweights. You best believe that all eyes were on them heading into race 6 at Bristol.
We have a crash. Kyle Petty, Jeff Bodine, Kevin Musgrave, and Bill Elliott all involved.
And Davey Allison just blew going into turn 3, took Ernie Irvan and Darrell Waltrip.
Yeah, the Food City 500 wasn't quite as kind to our 2 frontrunners, though through their strife emerged a 3rd contender, a fairly unassuming one, considering this would be just the 4th win of his whole career. But somehow, someway, this scrappy grassroots racer still finds his way into the story, because no matter what kind of equipment you put him in, Alan Kulwicki finds a way. He never had it all. He didn't come from wealth, he wasn't the offspring of a well-known racer, and he didn't have the backing of some Fortune 500 company. In fact, after selling basically all of his short-track racing equipment just to get to Cup, all he had to his name was a pickup truck full of tools, and even that would end up getting burnt down by an electrical fire. He was as green could be, but he was dedicated and pretty damn smart too. It probably doesn't come as a shocker that very few NASCAR drivers went to college, so when he showed up on car owner Bill Terry's doorstep with a mechanical engineering degree in hand, Terry decided to take a chance on the young Wisconsinite, giving him his first starts at the Cup level in the Hardee's car. Unfortunately, just 3 weeks into the '86 season, Terry ran into money troubles that forced him to sell off the team. So who would end up buying? Well, that would be Kulwicki himself, who decided that even amidst a tight battle with Michael Waltrip for Rookie of the Year, he wanted to become an owner, crew chief, team lead, basically the only full-time employee for his own team. It was an enormous undertaking, but he made the most of his 2-man single-car operation. And when I say single car, I don't just mean one team, I mean he ran only 1 car through the entire season, road courses and all. Despite facing organizations with far more manpower and money, he still managed to walk away from '86 as the Rookie of the Year. And from there, it was pretty much smooth sailing. Well, for Alan. For his employees, not so much. Alan might have been a mechanical wizard and a hell of a wheelman, but his people skills were a different story. After working for him for just 6 weeks at the start of '92, future Hall of Famer Ray Evernham said of him, "He was a genius, no doubt, but his personality paid for it. He was impatient, straightforward, very cut to the bone." And he must not have been alone in that opinion, because Kulwicki ran through crew members like tires and fuel. He just wanted to do things his way, so much so that he turned down an offer from Junior Johnson to drive the 11 car. That's right, that car that's been winning pretty much everything in sight. Allen was supposed to be its driver, but instead decided that he wanted to keep marching to the beat of his own drum. Needless to say, Junior didn't take the rejection well, as proven by him poaching Allen's potential sponsor, Maxwell House, during their negotiations. This Grand Theft coffee left Allen sponsorless and struggling in the first part of '91, but in Week 4 at Atlanta, he learned that he wasn't alone. Turned out that the restaurant chain Hooters was looking for a new team to back after their car failed to qualify for their home race, and when they saw a blank number 7 car sitting on the pole, they decided to plaster their logos all over it, and then they did it again, and before too long, they were celebrating in Bristol Victory Lane, striking up a long-term deal for what would eventually become one of the most iconic sponsors in the sport. Anyways, back to '92, the Hooters number 7 was back in Bristol Victory Lane for the second year in a row, though it's important to note that this was just Allen's 4th win of his entire career. He was about as far removed from the title talk as Denny Hamlin. This win merely padded a 99-point deficit to Davey Allison, but we've still got a lot of season left, and you best believe that we'll be seeing a lot more of Special K real soon. One more thing worth noting from this race was the runner-up, another dark horse, third-generation star Dale Jarrett claiming the new best finish for Washington Redskins coach and first-year NASCAR team owner Joe Gibbs. Just like his football season, he was 0-5 so far, and this looked to be his best chance yet, coming up just 27 laps short of his first win. But he need not fret, as his career in NASCAR would go on to mimic his career in the NFL, full of wins and full of championships. Oh, and one more thing, remember how Allison wrecked out? Well, that accident was more than just a feeble fender bender, as he suffered a bruised shoulder, costochondral separation, and 2 knocked vertebrae. If this was today's NASCAR, there would be no question of him running the next race. But seeing as a 30-year-old Brian France was still in Los Angeles schmoozing with big studios, Davey was cleared to compete. While he was in too much pain to practice or qualify the car, he would manage to start in the race at North Wilkesboro, ensuring that even if he had to jump out mid-race, he would still wind up with the points at the end of the day. His relief driver, Jimmy Hensley, sat in the pits waiting, but he would never get his chance to race, as Davey, in a spectacular showing of grit, would wind up running all 400 laps and winning. Despite the excruciating pain caused by his still-fresh injuries, Davey Allison, donning a flak jacket and electrode shock apparatus, would take his 2nd win of the year, a much-needed momentum boost heading into race 8 at Martinsville, where he would crash and hurt himself again. At this point, it'd be understandable if he wanted to take some time to heal, but when NASCAR rolled into Talladega the following week, Davey was there, saying, quote, "The real athletes, the good athletes, are the ones that can play hurt," and in strapping back into his jacket, and this time qualifying the car, that's exactly what he would do. And win again. 1 week after suffering a debilitating injury, Davey Allison would come back and win. And then he did it again. The dude was simply unstoppable, and that inhuman resilience would give him a 67-point lead over Bill Elliott heading into the All-Star break. A break that could have offered Allison a chance to finally heal. Since it was an exhibition race, he didn't have to worry about pushing for points. Instead, he would just be gunning for money and bragging rights. But this year's running of the Winston comes with more of those rights than ever, as in an attempt to bolster interest in the event, NASCAR would do something genuinely revolutionary. And not like the playoffs revolutionary, like actually revolutionary. Since its creation in 1985, the intrigue of NASCAR's All-Star race had been 2 things, the drivers and the money. It featured only the best the sport had to offer, and the grand prize, $500,000, the highest paying 70 laps in racing. For the drivers and the diehards, it was a blast, but its status as an exhibition event didn't appeal as much to the casual viewer. So in 1992, Speedway owner Bruton Smith would give them a reason to watch, as he spearheaded a project that would put lights around the 2,000-acre Charlotte Motor Speedway, at the time the biggest sporting venue ever to get lit. The endeavor went off without a hitch, and despite almost killing himself with the switchboard, Bruton said, "Let there be light," and revealed his 1.5-mile baby in perfect, evenly spread illumination. This was a draw that even the most hardened of consumers couldn't resist, and now that their fantasy was a reality, it was time to race. The first segment would see Davey Allison picking up right where he left off in the previous week by leading every lap and collecting the $50,000 bonus that came with. Then a fan vote would invert the field, giving Kyle Petty a clear path past his father to win the second stage. The final stint was a 10-lap bout that would see Dale Earnhardt move into second and, with a fortunately timed caution, take the lead from Kyle Petty seemingly for good. As Earnhardt pulled away under the waving white flag, it looked like his race to lose, but as Petty closed up in turns 1 and 2, the lights would prove to be too bright for the Intimidator.
And it's Kyle Petty. Kyle Petty coming to the checkered flag. Here comes Davey Allison to the bottom. It'll be the finish everybody was waiting for. They crashed past the finish line. They have crashed into turn number 1. And Davey Allison is in a shower of sparks.
He won the race, but he sure paid the price for it.
For the past month, Davey Allison followed a cycle, trading a crash for a win. He traded Bristol for North Wilkesboro, he traded Martinsville for Talladega, but tonight, on this one hot night in Charlotte, he didn't even have to trade. He managed to do both in the same night. While his car was hauled into victory lane, Davey himself was hauled off to the hospital, where it was revealed he had suffered a broken collarbone, a bruised lung, and a massive concussion spawned by hitting his head directly on the concrete wall.
He must have asked 10 times what happened. I said, well, pal, you won the race, but you wrecked. And he went, no way. And he'd go, what happened again now? I said, well, you won the race, but you wrecked. Wow. So what happened?
You're probably not surprised to hear that he would still show up for the following race, though instead of his usual checkers or wreckers routine, he would wind up in 4th. Somehow a disappointment for a man held together by band-aids. Instead, it would be Dale Earnhardt taking the win, lost in the headlines after spinning out on the final lap last week. Though unbeknownst to anyone at the time, this was the last time he would be in the headlines for the rest of the year. While it was a feel-good victory, his and Chevrolet's first of the year, breaking a Ford win streak that dated all the way back to October, it would also wind up being his only win of the year, as the twice-defending champ wouldn't return to victory lane for another 10 months. Said Earnhardt at season's end, it's been very trying and frustrating, but nobody ever talked about giving up, vowing that he and his team would be back with a vengeance come 1993. But keeping to 1992, Dover would see a battle of pit strategies, with handsome Harry Gant outlasting Darrell Waltrip to take his 4th win at the Monster Mile. Then the series would hop across the country to Sonoma, where Ernie Irvan would overcome an early stop-and-go penalty by blitzing the field and taking the win, dedicating it to NASCAR's founder, Bill France Sr., who had passed on earlier in the day. Next up was the tricky triangle of Pocono, where the Polish Prince would take his 2nd win of the year, and then came a dominant display from Davey Allison, who returned to form by making a fool out of the field in Michigan, his 4th victory of the season. Now normally the year would just keep moving right along, but NASCAR had an itch they had been waiting years to scratch. The very next day after Michigan, they would host a tire test that would gift the 10,000 spectators in attendance with a pretty cool title, being the first people to see NASCAR stock cars on the historic Indianapolis Motor Speedway. And it wasn't just a one-car test either. Even if it was just a mock event, they still got to bear witness to the first ever stock car race at Indy, and as the cherry on top, even got to see an icon of IndyCar, A.J. Foyt, drive an equally iconic car, Dale Earnhardt's black number 3.
All right, what do y'all think about NASCAR coming to Indy?
The test was a hit, and when NASCAR returned for the inaugural Brickyard 400 in '94, that crowd would be upgraded from 10K to 250,000, the most attended race in NASCAR history, and none of it would be possible without this one test. Funny how actually testing your tires can help. Anyways, back to the actual racing, Richard Petty would lead the final laps of his career, and Ernie Irvan would take his 2nd win of the season in the Pepsi 400. And by now, halfway through the year, the title fight was tighter than ever. Ironically, it wasn't Davey Allison's injuries that took away from his championship bid, as he always seemed to emerge from them stronger, but rather just a couple of uncharacteristically down weeks for Team 28 during the early summer. However, he still held a 46-point lead over Bill Elliott heading into Pocono, and as long as he could keep the injury bug in the rearview mirror, nothing could slow him down.
Oh, and he's upside down. Into the guardrail, side over side, end over end, and Davey Allison has experienced a horrifying crash.
Boy, let's hope that he isn't seriously injured.
In case you've lost track, this was the 4th major injury for Allison in just the past 4 months. In that time, he had sustained more bruises, concussions, and fractures than most of us will face in our whole lives. The dude was mangled. And still, the following weekend at Talladega, he relented, walking into the garage with bloodshot eyes, a broken arm, and Velcro on his glove and shifter.
If y'all want to see it, I'll show them to you, but it's ugly.
While he only stayed out for 6 laps before finally letting his relief driver relieve him, he had ensured that any and all points earned by the 28 car would be going to him. Bobby Hillin wound up finishing a decisive third, keeping Allison ahead of Elliott by just 1 point heading into the final third of the season. Unfortunately, he would lose that advantage in the following race at Watkins Glen, where Kyle Petty would beat the rain and win in a 51-lap shortened sprint. Then came a race at Michigan, where Davey was finally healthy enough to run from flag to flag, finally back to fighting form. That is, until a different kind of pain would permeate the Allison family whole. On the Thursday before the race, Clifford Allison, Davey's brother practicing for the Busch Series race, would lose control and hit the wall head-on, leading to his eventual death and transit to the hospital. Through every instance of agony Davey had suffered throughout the year, this was undoubtedly the worst, as no amount of broken bones or contusions can ever cut deeper than losing a brother. And as had been the case heartbreakingly often, many expected Davey to sit out for the rest of the weekend. But in his absolute lowest moment, when life seemed to test him the hardest, he answered the only way he knew how, by strapping back in and continuing his chase for the championship. He was unrelenting, unstoppable, and through his perseverance, he would produce a valiant 5th place result, keeping his title hopes alive for yet another week. As for the victor, it would once again be Harry Gant, unknowingly picking up the final win for Oldsmobile and the final win of his career, extending a record that still stands to this day, NASCAR's oldest winner at 52 years and 219 days old. The following weeks would see yet another veteran driver pick up his final wins, as 3-time Cup champion Darrell Waltrip would win a barn burner at Bristol and a drizzly day in Darlington that could have seen Davey Allison become just the second driver to win the Winston Million cash prize, but would instead see an oversight by his crew that allowed the 17 to stay out ahead of him until the rain started falling. And sure enough, DW's rain dance would work, allowing him to claim his 84th and final Cup victory in the most Darrell Waltrip way possible.
You know, I can go maybe 11 more laps.
Why'd your face turn so red when you said that?
The next race at Richmond would see a return to form for Rusty Wallace, followed by the same for Ricky Rudd at Dover, though at this point, the race for wins was merely an afterthought to the championship. While he struggled to find victory, Bill Elliott had just completed a 16-race stretch with no finish worse than 14th, whereas his competitors had both faced an array of adversity, with Kulwicki in particular finishing that same stretch with 3 sub-20th place finishes, putting him 278 points behind the championship lead with just 6 races to go. Most had written him off. Hell, most had never given him a chance to begin with. And after crashing out at Dover, even Kulwicki himself had doubts.
Not a very good day for us. Probably pretty much ruins our championship hopes for this year, but we'll be back.
But as they say, it ain't over till it's over. And luckily for our story, this battle was far from over. Bill Elliott would suffer an engine failure, giving him his first sub-20th place finish since the first race in Daytona. This offered a huge break for Allison, but unfortunately he faced some trouble of his own, a brake failure that took away his chance at a top 5 and gave it right to Alan Kulwicki. They would finish 30th, 16th, and 5th respectively, drawing both Alan and Davey closer to Bill. 5 races to go. A near-perfect caution-free race run by Jeff Bodine gave him his 2nd consecutive win, while the title contenders continued to struggle. Only this time, there were no outlying accidents or mishaps to point to, just a weirdly off day for all 3, as Davey finished 11th, Alan finished 12th, and Bill finished 26th, 8 laps down at his owner's home track. Youch, 4 races to go. By now, Junior Johnson was starting to get antsy, so much so that he had begun entering a 3rd car just to give his lead driver more points. Don't believe me? Well, when Elliott broke a sway bar and retired from the race 24 laps from the finish, that 3rd driver, Hut Strickland, was immediately told to park it, finishing 1 spot behind Elliott and giving him an extra 3 points for his trouble. So if you ever think you're being too petty, just remember, at least you're not Junior Johnson. Davey didn't fare much better, only mustering a finish of 19th, but the real success story of the day was Kulwicki. He couldn't quite hold off Mark Martin, who would run away to his 2nd win of the year, but he still managed to finish runner-up, and that's despite a gearbox problem that forced him to run the entire last stint of the race in 4th gear. With that, a championship lead that less than a month earlier was in the triple digits had vanished into the low doubles. The earth beneath the 11 team was beginning to crumble, as JJ grew increasingly impatient with his once dominant powerhouse. They needed to get their season back on track, and in the following race at Rockingham, they seemed to do just that. As Kyle Petty led 484 laps of 492, Bill Elliott finished a solid 4th, while his adversaries finished 10th and 12th. The cards were back in Bill's hands heading into the penultimate race at Phoenix. He didn't have to shock the world, he just needed to get to the end. And by the same token, his team just needed to do what they had done for most of the year, put together cars that, even if ill-handling, could at least run the rest of the laps. That's all he needed to win the Cup, just 2 more weeks of consistency.
Well, Elliott brings the car back in, and as you said, Neil, there's not a lot of hurry right now because there's not a whole lot they're going to be able to do.
Davey Allison will win it. Marlin tries to pin Kulwicki down, so they come to the flag. Waltrip will be third. Kulwicki will be the fourth-place car.
For the first time since Michigan, Davey Allison was in victory lane. And for the first time since Talladega, he was also leading the points. It had felt like an eternity since anyone but Bill was leading the championship. And Junior Johnson was so irate with his team's incompetence that he would go out on pit road with a hose and try and cool the motor himself. But it was no use. They would end the day in 31st, fumbling worse than the 2016 Falcons by turning a 70-point lead into a 40-point deficit. At this point, even Harry Gant, Kyle Petty, and Mark Martin, guys who were all but out of it in the week before, were still within striking distance. Somehow entering the last race under a points format that regularly saw just one guy clinching the cup weeks in advance, 6 different drivers found themselves with a chance to win. The Journeyman, the Prince, the Bandit, the Champ, the Prodigy, and the Underbird. With how crazy this season had been, any one of them could have wound up hoisting the Winston Cup. And heading into the season finale at Atlanta, the anticipation was palpable. But even still, the context of being the final ride for a legend and the climax to a year-long dogfight for the crown, no one in their right mind could have known just how special one race could be.
The sun sits low in the late fall sky, casting long shadows, giving you the feeling that you have to be at school or work tomorrow. But then you remember that there's magic happening down in Georgia, and all of that just kind of fades into the background. 1,000 orange and white balloons are released into the sky, and the air is unmistakably thick with tension. Never again would a NASCAR track be occupied by so many legends all at the same time for a points-paying race. The drivers here today will combine for 27 championships and 790 wins in the top division, all while the closest championship fight in the Winston Cup era came to a dramatic conclusion.
One of those drivers was a newbie, a 20-year-old Hoosier making his very first Cup start. Compared to the rest of the headlines dominating the weekend, his was more of a footnote, as any fresh-faced rookies would be. But in time, fans would come to appreciate him just as much as anyone on the track today. Winner of 93 races and 4 championships, Jeff Gordon will have one of the greatest careers in NASCAR history. And it all starts right here, on an already incredible day in Atlanta, made just that little bit more special.
The King himself, while driving in the last race of his illustrious career, gives the command to fire engines, and the cars roll off into destiny. Brett Bodine and Rick Mast occupy the front row and see an opportunity to nab a win while the big dogs are playing it safe for points. Combined, they have one win between them, and even that one lone victory came amidst some controversy. Brett Bodine wants to shake that off and win one without any dispute whatsoever, while Rick Mast is looking for his very first. However, behind them was a guy who everybody thought would be mathematically still in the hunt at this point, but he has had a miserable 92 season. He would have gone for a record-tying 3rd championship in a row, and knowing what we know now, he could have pulled off 5 in a row. However, his 1992 campaign was just absolutely miserable, and he pushes the top 2 just a little too hard going into turn 1 at the completion of the first lap.
Oh, and we have a spin. Bodine is in the fence, so is Rick Mast.
At the ass end of his worst statistical season, Dale Earnhardt would add one more gaffe to his reel, taking out both of the front row starters in one misguided send. He would end up struggling for the rest of the day, even spinning in the latter half of the race. A perfect encapsulation of a season that was about as far removed from his usual MO as it possibly could be. The spoiled meat, a double-decker championship sandwich. As for today's hopefuls, most of them would make it through unscathed, but Davey Allison, while braking to avoid the carnage, was rear-ended and given some left rear damage. Luckily, the tire didn't rub, so Allison could stay out on track and keep his position. An early bullet dodged by the ever-elusive Allison.
Ernie Irvan and Dale Earnhardt would take up the lead, but after a spin by Michael Waltrip on the backstretch, a caution causes the leaders to come down pit road for tires, gas, and adjustments. Alan Kulwicki has a routine stop with no incidents until the jack is dropped. He then mashes the gas pedal, only to hear a clunk. He has just broken first gear, and his teammates scramble to push him out of the pit box. Thankfully, he knows what to do to avoid breaking the other gears. The exact same thing happened to him at Charlotte earlier this year, a track very similar to Atlanta. He knows just keep it in 4th for the rest of the day. If he shifts around from 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, he risks moving pieces from the broken first gear into the transmission and breaking the thing entirely. He'll run the rest of the day entirely in 4th gear. His pit stop exits will be garbage for the rest of the day, but he will still be in the hunt.
After another yellow flag, the leaders would emerge as 4 of the 6 championship contenders, with all of them having led laps and thus secured 5 bonus points each. However, for the time being, those points were completely inconsequential. As long as Davey was running higher than 7th, he was a guaranteed champion. And as the 6, 7, and 11 tussled at the front, the 28 had a front row seat for all of it, watching comfortably from 5th place. On lap 85, another caution would re-rack the field, putting all 6 of our contenders back at the front, ready to duke it out. But then...
Down the front straightaway. Ken Schrader, Wally Donald back. Darrell Waltrip's involved. And
Richard Petty is flaming going into turn number 1.
He's knocked the oil cooler off his car.
Petty has got the car stopped.
Give me the fucking fire! It'll go out. Fire extinguisher!
Petty would joke afterwards that he went out in more of a literal blaze of glory than he had hoped. But the NASCAR world would have to watch the winningest driver in its history watch his final race from behind the infield fence. However, his team is determined to get the King back out onto the track to complete at least one more lap under green, and they work furiously to get the number 43 machine back into fighting shape. Meanwhile, our young newbie Jeff Gordon is having a tough day. Jeff had told his crew chief Ray Evernham that he liked to set up his cars extremely loose. It was a holdover from his days as a dirt track guy. But the Busch Series cars at the time had V6 engines and produced a lot less horsepower than the big V8s of the Cup Series. So much so that having a car that loose was just not practical at all. Needless to say, Wonder Boy is struggling out there. During the caution that took out Petty, Gordon's crew is taping up some body panels that have gotten scuffed up out there and leave a roll of duct tape on the deck lid as they send Jeff back out into the fray. That roll of tape lands on the track and none other than Davey Allison hits it and caves in a portion of his Thunderbird's nose.
As the race carried on, one thing became abundantly clear. The top 3 entering the race would be the top 3 leaving it. Kyle Petty had an ill-handling motor, Harry Gant was literally ill, and despite leading 47 laps, Mark Martin would wind up as the worst of the bunch, suffering a blown motor halfway through the race. This left the door wide open for the top 3 to settle it amongst themselves, though after hitting Gordon's duct tape, Allison fell back to 7th, clinging on to the points lead by a meager 6 points. Still, hopes were high in the 28 camp. After everything that's been thrown at them this year, they're proven to be ready for anything. Only an act of God, the devil, or fate itself could stop them now.
Crash! Davey Allison is in the crash, Bob!
Ernie Irvin, and it's all over for Davey Allison.
No, it's not over yet. I don't think he hit him that hard, maybe.
Well, he hit pretty well, I think.
This was honestly the only way Allison's season could end. After going checkers of records the whole year, he ended his season with a half-functioning car that paraded around the field just in case Allen and Bill wrecked each other. But, as fate would have it, they never did. They ran half of the race running nose to tail with each other. They spent 160 of 328 laps with the other guy either in their windshield or in their rearview mirror. The last 2 men standing would make a show of it.
As the final 70-lap stint got underway, Kulwicki held just a 10-point lead over Elliott, and with Bill stretching the gap, Allen was resigned to doing one of 2 things: staying behind the 11, keeping him in his windshield, or securing the 5-point bonus for leading the most laps while keeping within 1 spot of Bill. If he could do either of those 2 things, he would be champion. But anyone who knew Allen would tell you he's not the kind of person to hinge on hope alone. He wanted as much insurance as possible, so he clung on to the lead for dear life, fighting ferociously for as long as he could before making his final stop. The crew vouched for a gas and go, but once Fuelman and future Daytona 500 winning crew chief Tony Gibson pulled the can away from the car, he had a terrifying revelation. Allen might not have had enough fuel to make it. Now, they could have gotten a more accurate estimate by weighing the can, but crew chief Paul Andrews didn't want to know. As much as Allen hated it, only fortune could decide his fate. But as Bill pulled into the pits just 3 laps later, he would unknowingly lend a helping hand to his adversary.
If Bill and Allen had went to a tiebreaker, Bill would have won under the rules at the time, having 4 wins to Allen's 2. But on the last stop of the day, Bill Elliott's crew chief, Tim Brewer, made a mistake. He lost track of the 94 car of Terry Labonte, as he called Bill to pit road. Terry ended up leading 1 lap on a pit cycle that Bill could have had, leaving the final lap lead count at 103 for Allen and 102 for Bill.
Just 6 races ago, Allen was in a 278-point hole, about 56 positions worth of points behind the championship. But somehow, someway, he had dug himself out, even when faced with insurmountable odds, having to push and prod for every opportunity, for every possible point. The 7 was right there with the 11, both with a hand on the trophy, both staring down a chance at history. Only when history looked back, Bill blinked.
Bill Elliott comes off the 4th corner. He wins the Hooters 500. But Alan Kulwicki is coming off of corner number 4, knowing that he's winning the championship. There's the checkered flag for Alan. He's the champion for 92.
The call would guarantee a race win for Bill, but would cement the championship for Allen by just 10 points. Afterwards, Junior Johnson would fire Tim Brewer on the spot for the mistake. His fiery temperament had gotten them this far, and now it's how it's going to end for them. Bill and Junior would get one last win together at the Southern 500 in Darlington in 1994, and after that, Junior would sell off the team entirely. This would end up being both Bill and Junior's last shot at championship glory in the Cup Series.
As for Richard Petty, his team had managed to get him back out on the track, and although his car looked like a Whelen modified, they got him out with just enough time for 2 laps and a final salute to the people who had followed his career for so long.
It was a disappointing finale for Allison, but the culmination of a dream for Allen. And going into 1993, both had high hopes. Allen had looked to defend his title, while Davey resumed the hunt for his first. Allen had a less than stellar Daytona and Atlanta, but other than that, he'd had all top sixes to his name going into the spring race at Bristol, statistically his best track. Davey had a win at Richmond the third race of the year and had racked up top 10s in half of his starts going into July. Both were in position to repeat their fantastic 92 performances.
A plane crash last night in Tennessee has killed race car driver Alan Kulwicki. He and at least 3 other people were killed when their small plane crashed and burned near Bristol, Tennessee, where Kulwicki was planning to race on Sunday.
Mr. Allison, 32, of Hueytown, Alabama, injured in a private helicopter crash yesterday at Talladega Superspeedway. Died this morning at Caraway Methodist Medical Center.
I can't even fathom what it must have been like to be a fan in '93. You just watched the sport's rising talent win the Daytona 500 and its greatest underdog win the Cup. Now they're gone, both taken from this world at what would end up being the heights of their careers. They were the faces of the sport, 2 of the reasons why millions of Americans were glued to their televisions every Sunday. And within just a couple of months, they were both dead. And now, to the chagrin of their families, friends, and fans from all over, the sport had to move forward into a future that just seemed empty. But in retrospect, it makes sense. The 2 biggest prizes a stock car driver could dream of winning are the 500 and the Cup. And in their final seasons, they both realized their dream, though they could have done a lot more. And in my opinion, that's the greatest tragedy of all. We'll never really know. But what we do know is that after Earnhardt claimed his next and final 2 championships, that young kid in the Rainbow 24 would take over in the late 90s with 47 wins and 3 championships in just 5 years. As far as Bill Elliott was concerned, 92 would turn out to be his and Junior Johnson's last great shot at a championship, as after 2 more seasons together, Bill would follow in Alan Kulwicki's footsteps and become an owner-driver. Only he wouldn't experience nearly as much success, failing to nab another title or even a win for that matter. He would eventually resurge driving for Gordon's crew chief, Ray Evernham, but as he and the many other Lone Rangers of the 90s would find out, Alan Kulwicki was a one-of-one. Even to this day, he's the last one to truly do it all himself. He is, and probably always will be, the last true owner-driver champion. As for the iconic 43, it would never find the same success it did with Richard. I mean, duh. But it's still out there to this day, along with Earnhardt's number 3, Gordon's number 24, Wallace's number 2, Martin's number 6, and even Kulwicki's number 7, running with a new team but out of the same old shop it did when he was driving it. The only one that couldn't persist was Davey Allison's 28, as despite hosting a prolific lineup of drivers like Ernie Irvan, Dale Jarrett, and Ricky Rudd, none of them could fill the seat the way Davey did. But in retrospect, none of them were meant for that seat. Only Davey was, and had he lived to see 33, who knows what the 90s could have looked like. As for the sport as a whole, 92 was just the beginning, the stepping off point of a surge in popularity that would take NASCAR from being a southeastern niche to a national, even worldwide phenomenon, as those stars like Gordon, Earnhardt, and Wallace would represent the golden age of stock car racing. But even still, we see the hole, a gaping chasm that only the larger-than-life can leave behind. That was Davey and Allen, and while they only live in history, their memories will live on forever as we continue to tell the story of the greatest race and perhaps the greatest season we'll ever see.
So as NASCAR is crowned a brand new champion here this afternoon in Alan Kulwicki, we bid another very special farewell.